The courtroom was thick with tension, the murmur of the audience almost drowned by the heavy silence that had fallen after the judge's words. Judge Carver slammed his gavel down, his face a stern mask of authority. "You," the judge pointed a finger toward the defendant, "are a nobody. Your actions, your life, none of it matters to this court or to society. You're just a man who wasted his existence." The room was still. It wasn't the first time a defendant had faced harsh words from the bench, but something about the way Daniel Reyes stood there, eyes down, fists clenched, made the insult feel heavier. The whispers of the onlookers bounced around the courtroom, but Daniel didn't hear them. He was lost in his own thoughts, the words cutting through him like a knife. Was he really nothing? The case against him was serious. He'd been accused of insider trading, an accusation that threatened to ruin his career and possibly his entire life. To the outside world, he seemed like a man who had it all: sharp suits, expensive watches, a life most could only dream of. But in the dark corners of his mind, he knew better. He knew that none of this mattered if the truth was revealed. His gaze met the judge's. For a moment, the room seemed to disappear around him. Judge Carver was a seasoned man of the law, and Daniel could see that he didn't have an ounce of sympathy for him. A nobody. The words echoed in his mind. His father had told him once that the world would always see him as insignificant, that he would never be anything more than a shadow. At the time, Daniel hadn't believed it. But now, here he was, standing before this very man, feeling every bit the nobody he had been warned about. But that wasn't the whole story. Far from it. The courtroom doors creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. Detective Jacob Hayes walked toward the front of the room, a folder in his hand, his eyes locked on the judge. Everyone noticed, but no one expected what was about to unfold. "Your Honor," the detective said, his voice unwavering, "I have new evidence that changes everything about this case." Judge Carver raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? This trial is over. The man has been proven guilty." Hayes didn't flinch. He placed the folder on the judge's desk and slowly opened it, revealing a series of documents and photographs. "You're about to learn that Daniel Reyes isn't who you think he is." The murmurs of the courtroom grew louder as the crowd buzzed with confusion. The judge's face hardened. "Explain yourself, detective." Hayes turned toward the defendant, his expression unreadable. "Daniel Reyes, or rather, the man standing before you today, is not just any nobody. He is the heir to a fortune that could change the world. The true identity of Daniel Reyes is not that of a mere insider trader, but of a man whose actions have shaped industries, changed economies, and influenced powerful leaders. He is Jonathan Blackwood." The room went dead silent. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom as the name Jonathan Blackwood hung in the air. The name of a legendary business mogul, a man whose wealth and influence surpassed even the most powerful men in the world. The name of a man who had disappeared from the public eye years ago without a trace. Daniel's face remained emotionless, but inside, his heart raced. He had planned this moment for years. He had known that his past would one day catch up to him, but he hadn't anticipated that it would happen in such a public and shocking way. Now, the truth was out, and there was no turning back. Judge Carver's jaw dropped. "You're telling me that this man," he motioned toward Daniel, "is Jonathan Blackwood? The man who vanished without a trace years ago?" Detective Hayes nodded. "Exactly. He has been living under an assumed name for over a decade, hiding his true identity, and his reasons for doing so are as shocking as the man himself." The judge's hands trembled as he opened the folder, scanning the documents Hayes had presented. As he read, his expression shifted from disbelief to awe. "You're telling me that this man, standing right here, is the Jonathan Blackwood who—" "Yes, Your Honor," Hayes interrupted. "The same man. And the reason he's here today is not because he's a criminal, but because he's a man who has been hiding from the very empire he built. His involvement in the insider trading scandal was orchestrated to keep him under the radar. But the truth is far more complicated." The judge stood up abruptly, knocking his gavel against the desk in confusion. "This is impossible. You expect me to believe that this nobody is Jonathan Blackwood?" The world's most elusive businessman? The one who... Before he could finish, Daniel raised his head, his eyes locking with the judge's. "I've been living in the shadows for years," Daniel said, his voice calm but filled with intensity. "And now, the world will finally know who I am." The courtroom buzzed with chaotic whispers as the truth about Daniel Reyes, Jonathan Blackwood, began to sink in. The judge stood frozen, his gavel forgotten in his hand, and the room's attention was now fully on the man who had been accused of insider trading. No one could wrap their heads around the revelation. Jonathan Blackwood, the reclusive billionaire, the phantom of the business world, standing in front of them as an accused criminal. Detective Hayes motioned for silence, then turned back to Daniel. "You may wonder why, after all this time, he's chosen to reveal himself now. And why in such a public way? The answer lies in the very thing that brought him here today: the scandal." The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. All eyes were now on Daniel. He had been hiding behind the identity of Daniel Reyes for years, but now, with the detective's words echoing in his ears, he felt the weight of the moment. He knew he couldn't run anymore. He couldn't hide behind lies. The truth was now his only path forward. "I didn't plan for it to come to this. Daniel..." "No," Jonathan began, his voice quiet but carrying through the room. "The decision to assume the name Daniel Reyes wasn't made lightly. It was necessary for my survival." He paused, as if weighing whether to share his deepest secret with the world. The eyes of the courtroom were fixed on him, each person hanging on his next words. The judge remained silent, still processing the storm of revelations. "For years, I've lived with a shadow hanging over me, a decision made by someone who believed that the power I held could be used against me. But it wasn't just about power," Jonathan continued, his tone now filled with a raw emotion that struck the heart of everyone in the room. "It was about control." The murmurs in the room grew louder. The very idea that someone could live in the shadow of a name so powerful, so world-changing, was beyond the comprehension of many. Jonathan Blackwood wasn't just a business magnate. He was a symbol of wealth, influence, and secrecy. The world had watched as he seemed to vanish, and now he stood before them, a changed man. "I was born into the Blackwood Empire. My father, Victor Blackwood, was a man who built the conglomerate from the ground up. But he wasn't just a businessman, he was a tyrant. He controlled every aspect of my life, dictated every move I made." Jonathan's voice wavered, the pain of his words cutting through the air. "He was a man with a vision, one that included total domination. And I was his pawn." Judge Carver finally found his voice. "Are you saying your own father manipulated you, pushed you into hiding?" Jonathan nodded slowly, his eyes darkening as he remembered those years of suffering. "It wasn't just manipulation, it was abuse. He never saw me as his son, just as an extension of his wealth and power. I was never allowed to have a life of my own. My every action was scrutinized. My decisions were controlled. I was a prisoner of my own family." The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. "You ran away, then?" A voice from the audience dared to ask. Jonathan nodded again, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "I had no choice. The day I left, I knew it was either my life or his. My father wasn't just interested in building a fortune. He wanted to control everything, including me. He knew that the moment I became an individual, I'd be a threat to his empire. So I disappeared." The courtroom fell into an almost tangible stillness as the audience absorbed the story. "I faked my own death," Jonathan continued, "and assumed the name Daniel Reyes to escape his grasp. I knew that if my father thought I was gone, he'd leave me alone. For years, I lived under the radar, building a life with nothing but my wits. But no matter how far I ran, my father's influence still haunted me." Detective Hayes took a step forward, holding out a photograph. Jonathan Blackwood's empire, the one he built, isn't just about money. It's about power, manipulation, and the ability to destroy lives. "This man," Hayes said, pointing to Jonathan, "has been the victim of his father's cruelty. And now, after years of hiding, he's finally ready to expose the truth." Jonathan's eyes flashed with resolve. "I wasn't just hiding from my father. I was hiding from the world. I thought I could live in peace, build a life for myself, but I was wrong. You see, the moment I walked away from my father's empire, I thought I could leave everything behind. But the truth was, I was always running from a past I couldn't escape. The courtroom was stunned. The idea that the man standing before them was the heir to a business empire, hiding from his own family, was unimaginable. To them, Jonathan Blackwood was a myth, a man who had somehow escaped the grasp of the world's most powerful corporations. To discover that he was standing before them, vulnerable and exposed, was a revelation none of them were prepared for. The judge finally spoke, his voice heavy with disbelief. But why come forward now? Why risk everything by revealing yourself? Jonathan's eyes met the judge's, his expression unwavering. Because I've been forced into a corner. The insider trading accusations against me. They're part of a larger scheme, a way to make sure that my return to the world is controlled. My father's empire is crumbling, and he will stop at nothing to ensure that I never rise again. The room was in chaos as the implications of Jonathan's words sank in. He had not only revealed himself to be the heir to one of the world's most powerful fortunes, but had also suggested that his own father was behind the very scandal that had nearly destroyed him. Judge Carver sat back down, his hands shaking as he processed everything he had just heard. The court's perception of Daniel Reyes had shifted in an instant, but the road ahead was far from clear. The courtroom was in disarray. Journalists scrambled for their phones, eager to capture every word, every gesture of the man who had just revealed himself as Jonathan Blackwood. The truth had been laid bare, but this was just the beginning. Jonathan, Daniel, as the world had known him, had walked into a storm. But the real battle was yet to come. As the whispers died down, Judge Carver cleared his throat. This is unprecedented. We need to adjourn. There's too much to process. Mr. Reyes, or should I say, Mr. Blackwood, I'll need to have a private conversation with your counsel. The gravity of these revelations requires careful deliberation. The judge's words fell on deaf ears. The room was more interested in Jonathan. People couldn't fathom that the man accused of a crime they had been following for weeks was someone they had heard about in hushed tones. A ghost, a billionaire whose empire had influenced stock markets, real estate, and governments. Detective Hayes stood beside Jonathan, still holding the folder containing the documents that would expose everything. Your Honor, Hayes began, this is not just a case of insider trading. This is about power, control, and a man who has lived his entire life under a shadow that was cast by his father. The very man who is manipulating this case to ensure that his son remains the villain. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. His father's name, Victor Blackwood, was like a curse that haunted him. Everything he had worked for, everything he had done in the past decade, had been to escape the gravitational pull of that name. And now, it seemed his father was coming for him again. Victor Blackwood? The judge asked, his tone now filled with caution. You're telling me that your father is orchestrating all of this? Jonathan nodded, his jaw tightening with resolve. Yes, the insider trading case against me. It's all part of a larger plan to ruin me. My father controls much of the financial world. He has connections in places I can't even begin to describe. And he's using those connections to ensure that I never rise to the top again. The realization hit the courtroom like a wave. This wasn't just about a son turning against his father. It was about a multi-billion-dollar game of chess, where the stakes were life and death for those involved. Why didn't you expose him earlier? The judge asked, his voice laced with suspicion that Jonathan's expression hardened. Because I couldn't. He's always been 10 steps ahead of me. Every time I tried to speak out, I was silenced, disappeared. My whole life has been a series of moves dictated by my father. In this trial, this accusation, it's his final blow. Detective Hayes stepped forward, holding out a series of photographs. The Blackwood Empire isn't just about business. It's about control. Victor Blackwood has been manipulating the stock markets, pushing for hostile takeovers, and using his influence to undermine not only Jonathan's reputation, but his ability to run his own life. As Hayes laid out the evidence, Jonathan's story began to take shape for everyone in the room. There were files detailing fake transactions, illegal market manipulation, and documents showing that Jonathan's father had been a mastermind behind the scandal. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Jonathan's voice dropped to a whisper, his face pale with the weight of what he was about to say. My father, he's planning something much bigger. He's been using me as a pawn to take control of a global network of companies. He wants to build an empire that can't be touched by the law. I've spent years running from this, but the truth is I can't run anymore. The room fell silent. The audience, the press, even the judge were all caught in the gravity of Jonathan's words. The insider trading scandal was just a small part of the bigger picture. Victor Blackwood's manipulation had far-reaching consequences, and now Jonathan was trying to expose it all. But with the truth came the danger. Victor Blackwood isn't just a businessman, Jonathan continued, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. He's a criminal mastermind. He's been orchestrating illegal deals for years. And the moment I turned against him, he branded me as a traitor. He's been pulling strings, ensuring that I be caught in a scandal to ruin my reputation and any chance of taking control of the company again. Judge Carver was stunned. And you believe this? This conspiracy can be proven? Jonathan's eyes glinted with determination. I have the evidence. My father made one critical mistake. He underestimated my ability to stay hidden. He never thought I would come back. But now that I have, I'm going to make sure the world knows who he really is. The room was a buzz of activity, the tension rising as the gravity of Jonathan's statements settled in. Detective Hayes moved closer to Jonathan, his hand resting on the man's shoulder. You're not just exposing a criminal. You're exposing a man who has shaped global events. A man who has turned the world's most powerful institutions into his personal chessboard. Jonathan looked around the room, his gaze steady and unwavering. This is bigger than me. This is about taking down a man who has used his wealth and influence to destroy lives. This trial is just the first step in a battle that will change everything. The courtroom, still simmering with disbelief, felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Everyone had heard Jonathan's words, but few truly grasped the depth of the war that was unfolding. For years, Jonathan had been a ghost, hiding in plain sight under the alias of Daniel Reyes. But now, the man who had been living in the shadows was ready to face the empire that had ruled his life for so long. The truth was no longer an option for Jonathan. He needed to confront his father head-on, or everything he had fought for would be lost. Later that day, Jonathan stood in front of the window of his high-rise apartment, gazing out at the city below. The skyline gleamed under the setting sun, but for him, it felt like a prison. His mind raced through the memories of his past. The board meetings, the cold stares, the manipulation that had been his father's signature. He had escaped from Victor Blackwood's grip once, but now, with the world watching, the battle was about to begin again. The phone rang, pulling Jonathan from his thoughts. He picked it up, recognizing the number immediately. It was Hayes. Jonathan, we've got a serious problem, Hayes said, his voice tight with urgency. Victor Blackwood is already planning his next move. He's managed to pull some strings in the financial world. If we don't act fast, he'll turn the tables, and this trial won't matter. Jonathan clenched his jaw. What's he planning? We found evidence of illegal transactions tied to Blackwood Industries. But here's the thing. He's making sure it all gets buried. His network is so vast that we're up against more than just legal forces. You're not just fighting your father anymore. You're fighting a global system that he controls. Jonathan's mind raced. His father had always been steps ahead, and now it seemed he had already started his counterattack. But Jonathan was no longer the scared boy hiding behind a false identity. He was ready to take the fight to his father, no matter the cost. I'll deal with it, Jonathan said, his voice low but resolute. I'm not backing down. Let's make sure the world knows the truth. With the phone call ending, Jonathan paced the room, his thoughts locked on one thing: his father's empire. For years, Victor Blackwood had used his money and influence to control the fate of nations and people, twisting the system to his will. But Jonathan wasn't just a son anymore. He was a force in his own right, and the world would soon see that. Later that evening, Jonathan stood before the largest press conference of his life. News agencies, reporters, and cameras from every angle focused on him. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he stood tall. He was about to make the final move, not just to save his name, but to take down the man who had tried to ruin him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan began, his voice calm, but carrying a weight of authority, "I have lived in the shadows for too long. My father, Victor Blackwood, has controlled me, manipulated me, and turned my life into a battleground. Today, I am stepping forward, not just as a son, but as a man who has had enough." The crowd went silent, waiting for more. Victor Blackwood is not just a businessman. He's a criminal mastermind. For years, he has used his empire to manipulate the financial markets, orchestrate illegal deals, and ruin lives for his own gain. But today, I am revealing everything. I will not allow him to destroy my name, my legacy, or my future. Jonathan paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Cameras flashed, capturing every moment as he continued. "I have the evidence. I have the proof that my father has been pulling the strings behind not just this scandal, but a global network of corruption that has affected millions of lives. The time for secrets is over. I will expose him for who he truly is, and I will make sure that the world knows the truth about the Blackwood Empire." The reporters erupted into chaos, their questions bombarding Jonathan from all sides, but he remained resolute. This was it, the moment he had prepared for. The moment that would change everything. Back in his office, Jonathan stood with Hayes, the detective's expression grim as he looked over the latest files. "Victor won't let you walk away from this," Hayes warned. "He has resources you can't even imagine. But if you're ready to fight, we'll make sure you have the support you need." Jonathan nodded. "I'm ready. It's not just about me anymore. It's about everything my father has taken from people like me, people who have been crushed under his influence. It's time for a reckoning." That night, Jonathan sent the files to the press. Inside were documents detailing his father's illegal business practices, the cover-ups, and the ruthless methods Victor Blackwood had used to amass his wealth and power. The truth was out there now, and the dominoes were about to fall. The next morning, the media frenzy hit a fever pitch. News outlets around the world broadcasted the exposé. Headlines screamed about the fall of one of the world's most powerful families. Victor Blackwood was no longer untouchable. The once mighty empire was crumbling under the weight of the truth. But Victor Blackwood was not a man who would go down without a fight. As the walls around him began to close in, he issued a public statement. "My son is a liar. He has betrayed me for personal gain. This is an attempt to destroy my legacy, and I will not let it stand." But the truth was undeniable. As more and more evidence surfaced, Victor's empire began to unravel. Investigations into his financial dealings reached a fever pitch. It was only a matter of time before he would be held accountable for his crimes. As the trial date neared, Jonathan stood before the judge once more. This time, he wasn't the accused. He was the man who had exposed the greatest criminal empire the world had ever known. Judge Carver stood up, his expression a mixture of disbelief and respect. "Mr. Blackwood, you have made a choice today. You have not only stood against your father, but against an entire system that has allowed corruption to thrive." Jonathan met the judge's gaze. "It wasn't just my father. It was everyone who stood by and let it happen. But now, we can make a difference." The gavel struck, signaling the beginning of a new era. Jonathan Blackwood had taken down his father, but the victory was not just his. It was a victory for justice, for the victims of the Blackwood Empire, and for the truth. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the air thick with tension. Jonathan Blackwood had faced down his father, Victor, in the battle of their lives. The stakes had never been higher. This trial wasn't just about insider trading or market manipulation. It was about exposing the darkest corners of a dynasty built on lies, deceit, and corruption. And now, the final chapter was unfolding. Jonathan stood at the defendant's table, his face set with a mixture of determination and exhaustion. He had fought this battle for years, and now, with his father's empire crumbling around him, it was almost over. The evidence was irrefutable. Victor Blackwood's crimes were laid bare for the world to see. It was no longer a question of whether Victor was guilty. The question now was how far his influence reached and how long it would take to dismantle the entire network he had built. The judge, having already seen the overwhelming evidence, cleared his throat as he prepared to deliver his verdict. The court has heard all arguments, reviewed all evidence, and considered the facts. Mr. Blackwood, your actions, both as a father and as a business tycoon, have left a trail of destruction that cannot be ignored. Your son, Jonathan, has not only exposed you, but also revealed the systemic corruption you created. The law is clear. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment he had been waiting for, but it was not a moment of joy. It was a moment of closure, of redemption for a life that had been twisted and controlled by a man who never cared for him. As the judge spoke, the weight of the decision settled into Jonathan's bones. Victor Blackwood, you are hereby found guilty of multiple charges, including insider trading, money laundering, and racketeering. The court orders your immediate arrest. Your empire will be dissolved and all assets seized. A gasp echoed through the room. The fall of Victor Blackwood had been swift and brutal. A man who had once seemed untouchable, now stripped of everything. His wealth, his power, and his influence gone in an instant. As the bailiffs moved to arrest him, Victor's eyes met Jonathan's. For the first time, Jonathan saw a flicker of something that wasn't anger or disdain. There was fear, a fear of losing everything he had built. You think you've won? Victor spat, his voice shaking with rage. You're nothing but a child. I created you, Jonathan. I made you who you are. Without me, you would be nothing. Jonathan stood tall, his voice steady as he responded. No, father, you didn't make me. You tried to control me, manipulate me, but in the end, I made myself. I'm more than your pawn. I always have been. With that, Victor Blackwood was led out of the courtroom, his empire collapsing around him. The world watched in awe as the mighty titan of industry was reduced to nothing more than a criminal on trial for his life. But for Jonathan, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new in the weeks that followed. The fallout from Victor's arrest was nothing short of seismic. The Blackwood empire, once worth billions, crumbled as investigations into its illegal practices unfolded. Businesses were shut down, employees were fired, and millions of dollars were seized by the authorities. The truth had come to light, and it had been nothing like what the public had imagined. But Jonathan wasn't done. Despite the victory in the courtroom, he knew the work had only just begun. The people who had been hurt by his father's empire needed justice, and Jonathan was determined to make sure they got it. He started by publicly launching a fund for the victims of his father's corrupt business practices. It was a gesture, but it was a start, a way to right the wrongs that had been done under the Blackwood name. And as he stood in front of the cameras, announcing the initiative, Jonathan felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. He wasn't just Jonathan Blackwood anymore. He was a man who had overcome the weight of his father's legacy, and in doing so, had found his own purpose. No longer a pawn in his father's game, Jonathan was free to forge his own path. Meanwhile, the press, once obsessed with the scandal of the Blackwood empire, now turned its attention to Jonathan's future. Headlines praised him for his courage, his strength, and his determination to face down the man who had ruined so many lives. He had gone from a criminal suspect to a hero, and now the world was watching as he reclaimed his life. In a rare interview with a major news outlet, Jonathan opened up about the journey he had taken. This wasn't just about defeating my father. This was about standing up for what's right. I've spent too many years hiding behind a false identity, running from my own past. But now, I'm not running anymore. I'm facing the world as who I really am. As the story of his triumph spread, more and more people reached out to Jonathan, sharing their own stories of overcoming adversity, of fighting against systems of power and control. Jonathan had become a symbol, not just of personal redemption, but of the possibility that even the most powerful can fall. But there was still one thing left to do. Jonathan had one final confrontation, this time with the world. The Blackwood Empire, while no longer standing, had left a mark on the world that couldn't be easily erased. And as Jonathan stood before the ruins of what had once been a towering legacy, he realized that the true battle wasn't just against his father. It was against the very systems of power and control that had allowed men like Victor Blackwood to thrive. He wasn't just going to let it end here. Jonathan knew that with his newfound freedom, he could change the world, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by the powers that be. The fight was far from over, but Jonathan Blackwood was ready to lead it.